The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $90 on a cold Saturday morning, the 12th of November, 1983, at the old Miller Farm estate sale outside of Beaumont, Kansas, and Roy Truitt laughed so hard he had to lean on the fender of his Cadillac to keep his balance. $90 for a rusted iron donation box the size of a small footlocker, wrapped in 3 loops of a heavy toe chain, padlocked with a padlock so old and so worked over by weather that the keyhole itself looked like a wound. $90 for what Roy Truitt, in a voice loud enough to carry across the whole muddy yard, called the ugliest hunk of scrap he had ever seen a grown man pay real money for. The box itself sat crooked on the auction table, tilted forward like it was tired. It was cast iron on the sides and welded sheet steel on the top, and somebody a long time ago had painted it dark green, and the paint had failed in patches and left a map of orange rust and old primer showing through. There was a slot cut into the top, the width of a man's palm. The edges of that slot rolled down smooth from the touch of 1,000 hands, and 1,000 folded bills, and 1,000 nickels dropped in for 1,000 small reasons. On the front, in raised letters that had once been gold and were now only shadow, were the words, "For the orphans and widows of this county." And below that, in smaller letters, Elias Hobb Memorial Fund, 1937. The man who had bought it was Wendell Cranford, 68 years old that fall, a locksmith by trade in the town of Beaumont for more than 40 years, and before that an apprentice under a Norwegian named Olaf Bergen in Wichita, for 6 long years without a single day of true rest. Wendell Cranford was a lean man, stooped a little at the shoulders, from a life of leaning over benches and workboards. His face was deeply lined and browned from sun and cold wind alike. He wore a canvas jacket the color of dry hay, and a chambray shirt underneath it, and a soft gray work cap that had ridden on his head so long the sweatband had taken the shape of his skull. His hands were the story of him. They were long and thin and scarred, and the knuckles were swollen with years, and there was a permanent gray shadow under the fingernails from graphite and steel dust, and the pad of his right thumb was flattened from a life of pressing tumbler pins. Roy Truitt was 51, and he was the owner of Truitt Auto Sales out on Highway 54, and he was a heavy-set, ruddy-cheeked man with a clean shave and a haircut he drove all the way to Wichita to get every 3 weeks. That morning he wore a bright red sport coat and a bolo tie with a chunk of turquoise the size of a quail's egg, and he had parked his cream-colored Cadillac Sedan DeVille right up close to the auction ring so nobody could miss it. He had come to the Miller sale to buy a tractor, and he had bought the tractor, and now he was standing around watching the last odd lots go for pennies, and it pleased him greatly to watch old Wendell Cranford pay $90 hard for a rusted iron box that could not even be opened. He called it the tin coffin. He said it loud, twice, so the crowd around him would laugh, and the crowd around him did laugh, because Roy Truitt was a man who bought people beers and sold them cars on easy terms, and it did not cost anything to laugh at his jokes. The tin coffin, he said, and old Wendell was going to bury his money in it. Wendell Cranford did not answer. He paid the clerk in cash from a worn brown wallet, and he asked 2 young men standing nearby if they would help him load the box into the bed of his 1962 Ford pickup, and they did, and the truck sank down a full 2 inches on its old springs when the box came to rest against the cab. What Roy Truitt did not see, and what nobody in that muddy yard saw except Wendell Cranford, was the padlock. Wendell had walked up to the table before the bidding began, and he had put his hand on that lock the way a doctor puts a hand on a wrist, and he had felt the weight of it, and he had turned it over in his palm, and looked at the shackle, and looked at the keyway, and he had known 3 things at once. He had known that the lock was a sergeant in Greenleaf from before the Second World War. He had known that somebody had tried to force it more than once, and had failed, because the shackle showed the small silver crescents of hacksaw teeth that had skated off hardened steel. And he had known, from the way the box did not ring hollow when he thumped his knuckle against the side, that there was still something inside it. Wendell Cranford had learned his trade from Olaf Bergen, and Olaf Bergen had told him one thing so many times it had worn a groove in his memory. A lock, Olaf had said, is a conversation between the man who made it and the man who wants what is behind it, and the only rude thing you can do in a conversation is to shout. Wendell had never once in his life shouted at a lock. He had opened bank vaults after floods, and he had opened the strong boxes of dead farmers, and he had opened the diaries of women whose husbands had died with the little key in a pocket, somewhere unknown, and he had done it all with patience, and with the small steel picks he made himself on a bench grinder in the back of his shop. He drove home slow that morning with the iron box riding in the bed of the Ford, and the sky over Butler County was the color of old pewter, and a wet snow was starting to come sideways across the fields. He drove past the elevator and past the Methodist church and past the diner where 4 men were already sitting in the window watching him go by, and he did not look at them, but he knew they were there, and he knew by supper time the whole town would be saying that Wendell Cranford had lost his mind at last and paid $90 for a box of nothing. He backed the truck up to the double doors of his shop, which stood at the end of a gravel lane behind his house, and he winched the box down onto a wheeled dolly with a chain hoist his father had bought in 1948, and he rolled it inside and set it on the concrete floor under the good overhead light. He put a kettle on the hot plate for coffee. He hung up his jacket. He sat down on a stool and he looked at the box for a long time without touching it, the way a man looks at a stranger he thinks he might know. The story of Elias Hobb was one that Wendell Cranford had heard in pieces all his life, the way a boy hears the story of a battle his grandfather fought in, so that by the time he is a man he has 10 different versions of it, and no way to say which one is true. Elias Hobb had been the treasurer of the Beaumont Benevolent Society in the 1930s, back when the county was flat on its back, and half the farms were being auctioned off on courthouse steps, and half the children in the town were going to school with their shoes tied together with baling wire. Elias Hobb had put the donation box on the counter of the general store, and he had asked every man who came in with a nickel to spare to drop it through the slot, and by all accounts the box filled up steady for 2 winters running. And then, in the spring of 1939, Elias Hobb was found dead in the back room of that general store, and the donation box was found chained to a floor bolt with a tow chain and locked with the very Sargent and Greenleaf padlock that was now sitting in Wendell Cranford's shop. And the whisper that started that same afternoon, and never fully died, was that Elias Hobb had been stealing from the fund all along, and that when the board of the society had come to ask hard questions, he had killed himself rather than face them, and that the box had been chained shut because there was nothing worth counting inside it any longer. His widow, a small quiet woman named Cora Hobb, had moved to Wichita with her 1 daughter and had never come back to Beaumont, not for anything, not even for her own mother's funeral 3 years later. The box had passed from the society to the county, and from the county to a storage shed behind the courthouse, and from there, eventually, into the estate of an old commissioner named Ward Miller, who had died in October of 1983, and whose farm was now being sold off in pieces on a cold Saturday morning. The chain and the lock had never been cut, because to cut the chain would be to admit there was nothing inside worth the cutting, and Beaumont was a town that preferred its shame in a locked box to its shame out on the counter. Wendell Cranford knew all of this, because he had been 11 years old in the spring of 1939, and he had gone into the general store the day before Elias Hobb died to buy a spool of thread for his mother, and Elias Hobb had been standing behind the counter with his hand resting on the top of that green iron box, and Elias Hobb had smiled at him and had given him a piece of horehound candy for free, and Wendell had never once in the 44 years since believed that the man who had given him that candy had stolen from widows and orphans. The coffee boiled on the hot plate. Wendell got up and poured himself a cup and sat back down on the stool. He looked at the box for another long minute, and then he set the coffee aside and he went to his bench, and he took down a small leather roll of picks and tension wrenches, and he pulled up a stool close. He did not cut the chain that first night. He wanted to open the padlock. It mattered to him that the lock be opened, not broken, because Olaf Bergen had told him once that a lock broken is a question unanswered, and Wendell Cranford was a man who did not like to leave questions lying around on the floor of his shop. He worked on that padlock for the better part of 3 evenings. He took his supper in the shop, and he sat on the stool under the overhead light, and he worked with the small picks and with a tension wrench no thicker than a coping saw blade, and he listened. The sergeant in Greenleaf of that vintage had 6 pin stacks, with 2 spool pins set among the ordinary pins to catch the impatient man and send him around in circles, and Wendell knew this, and he moved from pin to pin with the same slow attention a piano tuner brings to the strings inside an old upright. He would set a pin and feel the plug rotate a half a hair, and then bind up on the next one, and he would back off and start again, and he was in no hurry. On the second evening, a young man named Toby Reams came by the shop with a bag of biscuits his mother had sent over. Toby was 19, and he had been coming around Wendell's shop since he was 12, sweeping the floor at first for $1 an afternoon, and now, 3 years into a proper apprenticeship, doing rekeys and small jobs on his own. He set the biscuits on the bench, and he stood at Wendell's shoulder without speaking, and after a while, Wendell felt him there and looked up. Toby asked him, quiet, if he was really going to spend a week on a lock that a $2 hacksaw blade would settle in 5 minutes, and Wendell smiled, not much of a smile, and he said that he supposed he was, and that if Toby wanted to learn something worth learning, he could pull up a stool. Toby pulled up a stool. He watched Wendell work for an hour without either of them saying anything, and then Toby went home, and the next night he came back again. Word of the $90 box had gone all around the town by then. At the diner on Main Street, the men in the window seat had settled on Roy Truett's name for it, and they called it the Tin Coffin, and every morning one or another of them would ask Willa the waitress if she had heard whether old Wendell had gotten his coffin open yet. Willa, who had a soft spot for Wendell Cranford, because he had once opened her mother's hope chest after the key had been lost for 19 years, would only shake her head and pour more coffee. Roy Truett came by the shop on the 4th day. He did not get out of his Cadillac. He rolled the window down and he called across the gravel to Wendell, who was standing in the doorway with a rag in his hand, and he asked, loud enough for a passing neighbor to hear, whether Wendell had found the pirate gold yet, or whether he was going to have to sell his truck to make his $90 back. Wendell looked at him for a long moment. He said only, "It will open," and he went back inside. Roy Truett laughed and drove away, and the Cadillac's white tires threw up a small spray of gravel that clicked against the metal siding of the shop. There is a kind of patience in a man that looks, from a distance, exactly like foolishness, right up to the moment when it doesn't. On the 5th evening, a little after 9 o'clock, with the wind coming hard out of the north, and the shop windows rattling in their frames, and Toby Reams sitting on his stool at Wendell's elbow, the last pin of the sergeant and Greenleaf lifted into the shear line, and the plug turned, and the shackle came free of the body, with a small, clean sound, like a held breath, finally letting go. Toby sat forward. Wendell did not. He set the lock down on the bench, gently, the way a man sets down a sleeping child, and he sat for a full minute with his hands folded in his lap. Then he stood up, and he walked around behind the box, and he unwound the tow chain, loop by loop, and let it fall in a heavy heap on the concrete floor. The lid of the donation box was hinged in the back and sealed in the front by a second, smaller lock, an inside lock built into the metal itself, and this one Wendell opened in about 90 seconds, because whoever had installed it had trusted the outside padlock to do most of the work. He raised the lid slowly. He did not look inside right away. He stood there with his hand on the raised lid and his eyes on the far wall of the shop, and he took a long breath, and only then did he lower his eyes. There was a canvas bank bag inside, folded flat on top, and under it a bundle of papers tied with brown string, and under that, filling the whole lower half of the box, a great weight of coins and folded bills in careful stacks, wrapped in wax paper and rubber banded, The rubber bands long since perished into black crumbs, and on top of the canvas bag, held in place by a small, round river stone, was an envelope. The envelope had once been white and was now the color of weak tea, and on the front of it, in a careful copperplate hand, were the words, "To whoever opens this box, from Elias Hobb, this 4th day of April, 1939. Wendell Cranford lifted the envelope with both hands. He carried it to the bench and he sat down. Toby Reams said nothing at all. Wendell took his pocket knife and he slit the envelope along the top edge, and he drew out 3 sheets of folded paper, and he unfolded them, and he began to read. The letter was not long. Elias Hobb wrote that he had been told that afternoon by the board of the Benevolent Society that he was going to be accused of stealing from the fund, and that the accusation was going to be made in the county paper the following week, and that the accusation was false. He wrote that he knew who had taken the money that was missing, because he had watched him do it, and that it was a member of the board itself, a man named Harlan Ward, who had been dipping into the till for 18 months and covering it in the books. He wrote that he had gone to the sheriff, and the sheriff had told him to bring proof, and that the proof was in the bundle of papers tied with brown string, which were the true ledgers of the fund, kept in Elias Hobb's own hand, and which showed every deposit and every withdrawal, and every date and every signature. He wrote that all of the money the town had given, every nickel and every dollar, was still there in the box, because he had begun 3 months earlier to keep the real fund in the box and the false fund in the bank, so that when Harlan Ward went to take from it, he took only from the false one. He wrote that he was afraid Harlan Ward would kill him before the sheriff would move, because Harlan Ward was the sheriff's brother-in-law, and that if that happened, he wanted whoever eventually opened this box to take the ledgers to the state attorney in Topeka, and to give the money to his wife, Cora, and to their daughter, Ruth, if they could be found. He wrote that he had chained the box shut himself that afternoon, and put the key of the padlock in an envelope addressed to his wife, which he had mailed that same evening from the post office on Main Street. He wrote at the end, in a slightly less steady hand, that he was sorry to leave a thing like this on a stranger, but that he had no one else, and that he trusted whoever would take the trouble to open an old, locked box would also take the trouble to do the right thing with what was inside. He signed the letter, Elias Hobb. Wendell Cranford read the letter through twice. Then he folded it and set it on the bench, and he put his face in his hands for a moment. And Toby Reams saw the old man's shoulders shake once, only once, and then Wendell straightened himself and wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist, and picked up the ledgers and untied the brown string. The ledgers were exactly as Elias Hobb had said they were. Every entry was in the same clean copper plate. Every signature of Harlan Ward on every false withdrawal was there. And when Wendell and Toby counted the money on the bench that night, under the overhead light, with the wind still coming hard out of the north, they counted, in coins and bills, $4,011.60, which had been in 1939 a small fortune, and which in 1983 was still a very great deal of money to a widow or to a widow's daughter. He could have kept it. There was nobody left in Beaumont who knew what had been in the box, and there was nobody left in the world who could have said what the box had held on the 4th day of April in 1939. He could have taken the money and burned the letter, and burned the ledgers, and let Elias Hobb stay a thief in the whispers of an old town, and no one would ever have known. He did not consider it for a moment. He asked Toby to stay in the shop and to watch the box, and he went into the house and he made 3 telephone calls. The first was to the state attorney's office in Topeka, where he left a message with a night clerk. The second was to a cousin of his wife's in Wichita, who had once known Cora Hobb from church, and through that cousin, over the next 2 days, he found that Cora Hobb had died in 1971, but that her daughter, Ruth Hobb, now Ruth Hobb Alden, was living in a small house on the north side of Wichita, 62 years old, a retired schoolteacher, a widow herself. Wendell Cranford drove to Wichita on the following Tuesday morning in his old Ford pickup, with the ledgers and the letter and the canvas bank bag and every last coin and dollar, riding in a wooden crate on the passenger seat beside him. He found the house without much trouble. He knocked on the door. A tired, dignified woman with gray hair, pulled back in a plain knot, opened it, and he took off his cap and he told her, quietly, that his name was Wendell Cranford, and that he had opened a box that had belonged to her father, and that he had brought her some things that were hers. He sat in her front room for less than an hour. He gave her the letter first, and he sat quietly with his cap in his hands while she read it, and he did not look at her face while she read it, out of respect. When she was finished, she put the letter down in her lap, and she looked at him and she said, "Thank you." She said only that. He gave her the ledgers and he gave her the crate, and he told her the name of the assistant state attorney in Topeka who was expecting her call, and he refused a cup of coffee, and he stood up to leave. She followed him to the door. She asked him what she owed him. He said, "Nothing." She asked him again. He said, "Ma'am, your father already paid." He drove home to Beaumont in the early dark, and he did not stop at the diner, and he did not stop at the church, and he went straight to his shop, and he swept the concrete floor, and he put the tools away. And he went into the house, and he ate a bowl of soup his wife had left on the stove for him. The state attorney's office moved on the ledgers within a month. Harlan Ward had been dead since 1958, but the record was set right in the county paper, and in the Wichita paper, and in a small notice in the Topeka paper. And the name of Elias Hobb was cleared, 44 years and 7 months after he had chained the truth into a green iron box on the counter of a general store. Ruth Hobb Alden used a portion of the money to place a proper headstone on her father's grave, which had lain unmarked in the Beaumont Cemetery since 1939, and she gave the rest, every dollar of it, to the County Benevolent Society, which still existed in a small way, and asked that it be used for the orphans and widows of the county, as her father had intended. Roy Truitt said very little about any of it. He was seen at the diner one morning the following spring, and he was heard to say only that he supposed old Wendell had gotten lucky, and the men in the window seat looked at their coffee and did not answer him. Truitt Auto Sales did not close, exactly, but it thinned out over the next 2 years, and in the summer of 1986, Roy Truitt sold the lot and moved down to a town outside of Houston, and the cream-colored Cadillac went with him, and after that his name was not much spoken in Beaumont. The green iron donation box was put on a small oak stand in the front hall of the Beaumont County Courthouse, with the tow chain looped once around it for memory's sake, and the old sergeant and greenleaf padlock resting on top, open, its shackle raised. A brass plaque beside it told the true story of Elias Hobb in about 150 words. Wendell Cranford went to see it once, on a Wednesday evening in April of 1984, after the courthouse had closed, when the janitor let him in through a side door as a favor. He stood in the empty hall for maybe 5 minutes. He did not touch the box. He read the plaque through once, and he nodded, and he put his cap back on, and he went home. Toby Reams took over the shop in 1991, when Wendell's hands finally gave out, and he still runs it. And he still keeps a small leather roll of picks that Wendell made for him with his own hands on a bench grinder in the back of that shop. So I'll leave it with you. If you had been the man who paid $90 for a rusted iron box that the whole town was laughing at, and you had opened it in the middle of a cold November night and found a letter and a ledger and $4,000 in old money, and you had known that nobody living would ever know the difference, would you have driven to Wichita the following Tuesday with a wooden crate on the seat beside you, or would you have closed the lid and gone quietly to bed?